Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Thursday, September the 11th, and Downing Street is digging in hard. They want Peter Mandelson to stay. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElroy from Politico, and welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's, the podcast that gives you everything you need to know for the day ahead in British politics in around 20 minutes. And what a day it's going to be.
Most people I talked to were pretty speechless, if I'm being honest, at the mess this government are in over Peter Mandelson, kind of less than a week after they're in another mess over Angela Rayner. It's pretty much the biggest thing out there today. And of course, it's our big topic for this podcast. And there's quite a lot else besides.
Today, they're going to boast that a record number of sponsor licenses will be revoked from employers who are found to be exploiting illegal migrants. Now, Sam, that is connected to the reason I can see that you are on the road with my advanced detective skills in a hotel room.
Welcome to Birmingham, where Sky was last night hosting a debate on immigration. It was quite fascinating. I sat and watched the audience and the panel members. It's quite clear that politicians are far happier attacking each other over rhetoric and positioning than they are over solutions. And I think we're going to have many, many more years of this. But the passion of the audience, not only from those that want to clamp down on migration, but also from those that want to defend the right of people who have arrived from countries like Afghanistan, very striking. So politicians need to polish up on their language. But there is one story that is dominating all others in politics. Of course, there is the tragedy overnight in America, but we're going to focus on what's going on with a very important person for the Prime Minister. So that we have a second massive figure that connects to this government in a week being in big trouble. The Tories and Reform, and now the first Labour MPs like Bell Ribeiro Addy and Richard Bergen are calling for Peter Mandelson to be ousted from the ambassador's residence in Washington. And again, and we've seen this pattern time after time, Keir Starmer's initial instincts is to go in hard and go straight for the defence. Probably like you, Anne, I've spoken to so many people in the last 24 hours, from his closest friends to people at the heart of government. And the consensus amongst all of them is that this is an unsustainable situation. That, everybody I speak to seems to think he'll almost certainly go. Quite a lot of friends seem to think he should go. And they're dismayed that number 10 is where they've ended up. And these are friends of the government and supporters and people who work in the government. But there we go. That is what Keir Starmer has decided, and all of it over, and it is a difficult subject, and it's a difficult subject for early in the morning, but it is over Peter Mandelson's long-standing relationship with the now deceased Jeffrey Epstein. It's a tricky and nuanced story, and do you want to just take us through it?
Well, the recap, or at least the short version of a very tangled tale, as you reflect there, Sam, that goes back over decades, was Peter Mandelson's close relationship with the late sex abuser and serial trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, now threatening his future as ambassador to the US, appointed by Keir Starmer to keep that relationship solid and to make the connections that Starmer, I think, knew that he was lacking himself in the US. Now, what was not anticipated then was the way that the spectre of Mandelson's association with Epstein would come into the public domain, i.e., we were not really supposed to know about this in the detail that we now know about it. And I think that has caused the root problem here for the ambassador. And that is because files from the Epstein estate have been opened up by a congressional committee in Washington, and a cache of messages and tributes made by Peter Mandelson, including glowing ones to his so-called best pal Epstein, lots of slightly icky praise for him and his multiple properties, basically his wealth. Now, in the public domain, which Mandelson immediately accepted was embarrassing. They come from a birthday book compiled by Ghislaine Maxwell, the former girlfriend, but also the accomplice of Epstein in trafficking and finding and training up these young women and girls for sex with Epstein and his circle of friends. Obviously, there's no suggestion of impropriety there by Peter Mandelson directly on that sexual aspect. But the question is, why was he lionizing this man with photos, with these clammy messages, and defending him even when the first court case had been brought successfully against Epstein in Florida over basically soliciting young women for sex? So it does look like Peter Mandelson's judgment is very strongly in question there for many, many years. And also, why was this kept from us until now?
To go over the timeline of this week, we saw those messages and photos, the birthday book, the stuff opened up by the Congressional Committee Monday over into Tuesday. Then yesterday morning came the marmalade dropper. Lord Mandelson decided to get ahead of the story, which I suppose he had to do. I'm not entirely clear that this has landed as well as he might have hoped, but by giving an interview with the Sun's Harry Cole over in Washington. And here's the bit that you just touched on. That's when he revealed he'd continued to see Epstein after his conviction. And that he also said that, and this is the thing that drags this out, that there's an email correspondence, he said in the interview, that was between Epstein and him, which is about to come out. And that duly started to leak in the hours that followed, courtesy of the Times, Sun, and Bloomberg.
Well, let's go back to the birthday book. Now, remember that was published or pulled together before the first indictment of Epstein. So that is Peter Mandelson's defense here, that he couldn't know what was going to come in the future. But the revelations that have really pushed him into the danger zone, I think, were those messages of support written after that 2008 conviction in a Florida court for soliciting sex with a minor. Now, the point here, Sam, is that Mandelson unquestioningly supported his friend, writing he was, quote, hopeless and furious about what had happened. It just could not happen in Britain, and counseling him actively, strategically, talking about the art of war and all of those metaphors, saying basically, you're going to get through this and I'm going to help you, and to aim for early release. There's no sense in these messages that he wonders what on earth has become of his friend, that he has ended up with this conviction. And this, knowing this circle a little bit, going back to that time, was a big dividing line in the group of friends and acquaintances around Maxwell and Epstein. So plenty of people did realize once that had happened that this was a time to cut ties. Peter Mandelson did not. He says it was the result of being deceived by a charismatic liar in Epstein, as he describes him. He clearly believed his friend had been unfairly convicted. Why was that the case? Why did he assume that? But also, in this milieu, it was well known, Sam, that there were young women hanging around these luxury properties. It was joked about routinely. Mandelson even talked of being in the kitchen with interesting friends, a couple of young women, and one of them who just seemed to be staying at the property, and turning that sort of blind eye to these associations was something that I think is now the problem that comes back to haunt him, that he finds it harder to talk about. He says he was deceived. He uses the passive tense a lot. What about the fact that he wanted to be around Epstein, so he let himself be deceived?
I think politically there are two areas of big questions. The first is about judgment, and the second about whether or not we are learning things that were not known either in the public domain or to government at the point he became ambassador to Washington. And you only have to look at that Bloomberg report of those emails to understand that when it comes to judgment, it feels like Peter Mandelson is in such difficult water. You read out a couple of the quotes from Peter Mandelson. Let's be absolutely clear what was going on. Peter Mandelson wrote to Jeffrey Epstein the day before he was due to report for jail in 2008. So he'd been convicted for soliciting sex from a minor, and Peter Mandelson wrote him that message of support. And that's when he said, I think the world of you, and I feel hopeless and furious about what has happened. I can still barely understand it. So this is post-conviction, the day before he's due to go to jail. What does Lord Mandelson say is the case for his defence? Well, yes, as you say, it was that Epstein's lawyers were telling him it was a criminal conspiracy, and he relied on those assurances that turned out to be horrendously false. But again, judgment, very much part of an ambassador's job, needs to be relied on. And I think there were plenty others who were taking a different course of action as a result of what had gone on.
2 points just picking up on what you say there, Sam. One is that I think Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson now, genuinely feels like this. Obviously, he's defending himself. He's fighting for his job and his reputation here. He does say as a gay man, he was with his partner, Ronaldo de Silva, throughout most of these visits, or many of the visits. He said he was perhaps impervious to some of the more sordid signals that were going around in Epstein world. But there is also a bit of a problem, I think, which is also inside Peter Mandelson himself, which is the sort of "is it all about me" vibe. And there's quite a convoluted defense that talks about the victims. I mean, as the days have gone by, talks about them more. That is true, but in a bit of a drive-by way, that they were on his mind. His thoughts were with the victims. But ultimately, Sam, he sees this Epstein saga, this toxic story, as he puts it, an albatross around my neck, i.e., a problem for Peter Mandelson. And that does raise the question, if you'd found this to be weighing on your conscience for so long, over so many years, why not come clean about it before it came out in emails dug out by Bloomberg, the Times, and the publication of the birthday book? In fact, when this was raised with him in a Financial Times interview, he told the FT in no uncertain terms to go away, rather rudely, because he didn't think it was relevant and it was all in the past, etc. So the idea that this had been weighing on his conscience, I'm sure it had weighed on him, but there was another route which could have been taken, and that would have been an earlier transparency.
Oh, you refer to the FT. My colleague James Matthews did an extraordinary, what's known as a doorstep in the business, of Peter Mandelson to ask about him, and Mandelson gave some rather kind of aggressive replies. They were furious that we'd done that, and I think there was I think we were put in the deep freeze for quite some time. So you're completely right about all of that. This is a problem for Peter Mandelson. It's a problem for government. And before we talk, I want to talk to you in a moment, because you've reported on this for decades. You've been reporting this. I hate to say it, but from before I entered journalism, so you have a very long and detailed knowledge of all of this. But I want to just deal with the politics of what the hell is going on in Downing Street. Right, we are less than a week from the state visit. Next Wednesday, Donald Trump touches down for a second time to visit the UK and meet the King. There is massive nervousness in Number 10 and across government about how this visit's going to go. There are elements of it, I am told, that are unsorted. There is worry. There are worries. One person was worrying to me in the last 24 hours that there are moments in the schedule that are not fully programmed, and that Donald Trump could go rogue and meet Nigel Farage for coffee or in a pub outside Windsor. They just don't know quite how it's going to go. Sorting all of this is a big part of the ambassador's job, so the timing is horrendous. Almost incredibly, the argument that Number 10 is making to defend Lord Mandelson is that they knew. They are saying he can stay because Number 10, and presumably, sort of hopefully, Keir Starmer, was aware that he continued to see a convicted paedophile for some time post conviction. That is a hell of a challenging defense. And yes, no, it's fine because we knew he was seeing the convicted paedophile. Right. That is the defense. That is the official line of Number 10 in effect. I'm slightly paraphrasing, but that's the position they're clinging on to. And what they are saying in Number 10 is, full due diligence was done, full disclosure was done, and we took all of these facts into account. Everywhere else in government, I have to say, people are unconvinced, to put it mildly. Now, there's a bit of process going on that I don't think Number 10 are going to like. I am told that the lead civil servant in the Foreign Office, Ollie Robbins, remember him, has actually written to Peter Mandelson to ask us a series of questions. And they're questions like, when did you last meet Jeffrey Epstein before he took his own life? When did you last accept hospitality? What were your last business dealings with? So a sort of pretty... Because in other bits of government, Number 10 sort of say that they know it all, but in other bits of government, they're sort of throwing their hands up in the air and going, what on earth actually happened? Can we please establish the facts of the matter? We can't have stuff sort of dripping out in emails at unknown. So there is And I think the reply to that letter, if Number 10 lets this process go ahead, is going to be pretty key in determining whether or not Peter Mandelson survives. Because, and I'm going to make this one point, which is in some ways that my biggest question for everybody in all of this, the biggest gaping hole in my factual knowledge, and as far as I can tell, everybody's factual knowledge, is that nobody knows the last time Mandelson saw him. We just don't know. We have had evidence of 2008, but was there something subsequent to that? I am being told, and that is not a fact that people can tell me the answer of. Now, I find that hard. Somewhere there must be a vetting team, probably with links to the security services, because that's what propriety and ethics do, who have checked all of this out, and that answer must be available somewhere. But for some reason, if you put that question through the normal channels, an answer does not come back, and there are a lot of people that, even at the top of government, who simply does not know. So my question is, when did Peter Mandelson see him last? Did he accept hospitality? And does Keir Starmer know that date? Or did Keir Starmer choose not to find out that date because the whole of this was just a bit too toxic and he felt it was better not to know personally? Don't expect Number 10 to start giving us answers readily to all of this. By all means, come and contact us privately if you know the answer to any of these questions. But that is where journalistic endeavour, I think, is going to end up going.
Process, as you point out, is usually the way, and the grinding process, once things have emerged that should have emerged previously, but in the messy way of these things, and they come out as they do, and also thanks to journalists. Let's be honest, much loathed journalists who keep scrapping away at this.
As it was in Andrew Rayner's case.
Indeed. Now, that I think throws up the question that you raise, which is, was this process of the appointment of Peter Mandelson so fast tracked? Which it did appear to be so, because Keir Starmer really wanted it, was advised that he needed. It was to balance out the fact that Keir Starmer is not well known in Washington. He's not familiar with the power structures. Peter Mandelson certainly was, and in many ways did seem like the answer to that, if you were going to move on from Dame Karen Pierce, who is a career diplomat, was well seen in the Trump administration, who today might be ever so slightly thinking over her coffee told you so, because she made it pretty clear to me in an interview the previous summer before she was told to move on, and Peter Mandelson came in, that she would like to stay. She said, I would have to be dragged out of here by my fingernails. But there was that feeling that Keir Starmer wanted his own person, that kind of political diplomat in there. I could also see the logic. I mean, let's not all have my hindsight is super good, right? My 2020 vision in hindsight is as good as anybody else's. I could see the argument for putting Peter Mandelson in there because we needed to get those trade and technology deals, etc. And at some point, you were going to have to move on from Karen Pierce. But, and this is where I think you are absolutely shining your Boy Scout torch into the right corner here, is that the process of that as well. Was the vetting as thorough as it should have been? That is what Ollie Robbins will look into. There will be a slight sense in the Foreign Office that this is belated, but that it needs to happen. And why was the Cabinet Office advising that Peter Mandelson's recommendation way back in the Blair years, that Blair ought to meet Epstein? It would be great for everyone involved. Why is that being kept from us? So the trouble with this is you start with one nasty secret and a model, and then others seem to flow from it, which people don't want to go near. And I think that's the, don't put words in your mouth. That seems to be what you're saying, is that there was a kind of knowledge that so much of this was maybe problematic or a bit troublesome, that if you could just lock it in a cupboard and put it somewhere in the early 2000s, then there would be nothing to see here. I do think that is now rebounding, not just on Peter Mandelson, but on Keir Starmer. And there was a slightly cursive Keir moment, wasn't there, yesterday? Where you thought, oh, is he going to back someone else who's going to have to resign? And everybody's tearful. Everybody's in tears around the Labour project with Mandelson, Rayner, Rachel Reeves. This is feeling like another layer of instability. I think they just have to decide in the next days, one way or the other. It's going to be after the state visit. Do you let Peter Mandelson go? Or are they going to stick with him to the bitter end? But as you say, I think that is getting more difficult by the day.
There is a nuance around Peter Mandelson's appointment. I think this was driven through by Morgan McSweeney and Jonathan Powell. Of course, Keir Starmer was up for it, but there were points at which Keir Starmer had doubts. Keir Starmer had heard stories that Peter Mandelson had not been entirely obliging of him when Peter Mandelson did not have a role in the Labour kind of landslide and return to power. And I think there were moments where Keir Starmer was in two minds, but went with the judgment of Morgan McSweeney, who I am told is in very, very close, regular, at points daily contact. We see lots of Peter Mandelson going in and out of Downing Street, particularly when you think he should be over in Washington doing his job there. And I think, there are some that think that after the ambassadorship, Mandelson wants to go back to number 10 to reprise that role he did for Gordon Brown, help Labour win the next election. Looks a little bit harder this morning. I'm going to give you something I have been told, that if you shuttled this to Downing Street, it would be denied, but I believe my source. And that is that inside number 10, they are doing some hush-hush contingency planning in case Peter Mandelson does not survive. Of course they are. That's what governments do. That's what officials do. And number 10 denying it is what happens at this point in the cycle. It's a bit irritating, but it's just the case. I'm not sure Karen Pierce is on that list. Views differ. And there's a lot of psychodrama, I think, around that. But they are going to look for somebody who's going to take down the temperature in the event that they have to dispose of him. And just give me just quickly, because we're slightly out of time, just give me a sense of the sweep of history of all of this, because you have done this for literally decades, this issue.
I think the thing to remember here, when you mentioned Morgan McSweeney, is that he first worked as part of a team under Peter Mandelson. I mean, we're going way back, to the Old Testament of New Labour, that fight against the left. It's funny, it just keeps coming around again, as Carly Simons once said. And I think that sense that Peter Mandelson is more glued into the New Labour project and its heirs and descendants, yea, unto the Keir Starmer government today, than anybody else that I can think of, has given him a kind of bulletproof protection. And I think it has also led to some misjudgments, I should say, along the way. I think Peter Mandelson's been very, very effective in many roles, and then sometimes incredibly accident prone in multiple resignations when he was a minister, etc., often to do with that nexus of wealth connection and politics, but that in many ways that was what was wanted of him. And I think you're right that he ended up in this role because of Morgan McSweeney and Jonathan Powell. But in the end, the word prime minister tells you who makes that decision. And it was a controversial one because the Foreign Office were absolutely horrified, because they're just like, well, if we can't keep Karen Pierce there, what about another one of our own, who've done big jobs elsewhere and would be very competent in the role? It was an active decision to put him there. The only thing I would say, as you say, I didn't know Jeffrey Epstein, but I did know Ghislaine Maxwell reasonably well from student days onwards, and in her time in New York. I was aware that she built up this role as a sort of queen of networks in New York, and it was years after that 2008 conviction that I think I realized, made a documentary about this. It's somebody I thought I knew pretty well, who was a bit of a social butterfly, was a very entertaining person. She was very loyal to a mutual friend of ours who had an addiction problem and died. I saw the good sides of her, but that I had not realized that how deep and dark and terrible this trafficking network went, her role, and the real evil that Jeffrey Epstein perpetrated. So I did see a bit of how things emerge through a glass darkly, but emerge they did. And that is, I think, the problem that faces Peter Mandelson, the ambassador today. That too much of this was in plain sight. And, this is a Labour government that is campaigning on violence against women and girls. Where is that in this picture?
Okay, we've bust over our time limit. Bridget Phillipson and Lucy Powell are going to be, it looks like, the two candidates for Labour's deputy leader, but there's no time to go into that. We will be back on Monday to see whether or not Peter Mandelson is still in his job, and that'll be 48 hours before Donald Trump lands in the UK. I'll see you then. Have a great weekend.
Perfect timing. And what do those two candidates make of the Mandelson story? They're bound to be asked about that. Thanks, Sam.